Hello and welcome to another one of our book clubs. Today I'm looking at this book called Shamanism. Shamanism by Mircea Eliade. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. This is quite different than the usual books that I read in terms of magic. I am also very much involved and interested in the history of magic. I would by no means consider myself to be a historian of magic, simply because my memory is not good enough. So I read a lot of stuff, but I can't retain all that specific information. But I think I have a general understanding of the spectrum of magic. So I do read books like this, which are, I would say this is related to magic. And the reason why I read this book and why I want to talk about it is I am myself writing a book. It's called, I might change the title. I think I have a title, but I am writing a book. One of the chapters is on the early history of magic, sort of a book on the early history of the world, and I want to talk about where magic came from. It's something that's very glossed over in a lot of magic books, and to be quite honest, a lot of the history that they give in terms of magic tricks is manipulated, it's skewed, it's based on their worldview, and their worldview is that magic doesn't really exist. So their starting points on the genesis, the origins of magic, is quite different than what I think it was. And you hear these people, so in my interest in history, I'm interested in all aspects of history, and one of the things that I love is that history is so vivid in the stories and what we call the mythology, the stories of this time, that many people discount these days, and they call it mythology, they call it legends, they call it, these fictional stories that these people came up with. I personally don't just discount them, just because our understanding of the world is different than it was a few thousand years ago. I don't think it is fair to just discount it. So you do see a lot of stuff in here and another, all sorts of history books which describe magic, and they describe it as being real magic, but when you look at it, it has very strong parallels between the magic that we see performed and through our art form, which is an art form based on secrets and techniques, and they present it in a different way through the history, but it's all correlated. So, for example, in this book, the book is about shamanism. So, to summarize the idea of what a shaman is, these were people who, in a time probably before what we would understand as organized, institutionalized religions, these were people who interfaced with different spirits, different godly, spiritual, celestial powers, or what they claim. And there's a lot of different perspectives on it. So one of the things that I found interesting, and it comes up in all these history books, is that most of these people are born into it. There is something genetic to it. There is something with their family bloodline into it. They're born into it. It's a role that's passed on to them through their family. And these people, so that's one route in terms of how they're selected for this occupation, which is this spiritual, almost like a spiritual council, but a very powerful one for their tribe or for their group of people. And the other way that they come into it, and many times it's related to the family, but it doesn't need to be through the family. Anyways, a lot of these times, these are people with some sort of mental what we would call mental disorder. I think now we would consider it to be some sort of mental disability or mental illness. But many times there is something wrong with them. And they talk about the possible causes in terms of the lack of vitamins in different regions of the world, which might, cause these things in people. But this is what's thought to be able to allow these people to interface with this alternate, supernatural reality. And when that fails, then they turn to other things, which, they talk about the abuse in this, but we're talking about pharmaceuticals now. And so I want to talk about, the people who do become shamans usually have some sort of a trauma early on in their life. There's some sort of, many times, I guess we would call it a psychosis, but some sort of disconnection from reality and from their tribe, which opens them up to these alternate experiences. And they all go through an initiation period, which is usually they're mentored either by an older shaman, or they're mentored solely by the spirits themselves to learn the secrets of whoever it is initiating them, and turning them into that special person who's going to act as a shaman for that tribe. It's quite interesting, the language and the traditions. You can see it through the book, passing through the different parts of the world, and how the language, people who study language can trace the similarities in the words and the derivations that pop up, and how they are able to connect these things from India to China to Siberia to the Arctic, and all over the place. And Europe, going to North America. It's fascinating stuff. And then the stuff that they are able to do, which ties into the magic that we see historically. For example, there's fire eating. Now, a lot of people know fire eating. They've seen it on a sidewalk. Somebody's doing fire eating, and this is a very old thing. We have documentation of it from thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago. But the first time that we really understand that it's a trick, because it's published as a deceptive thing, it could be older than a few hundred years, but I've seen it talked about as being a trick from a few hundred years ago. So you'd have people who would be able to swallow or eat or go into very hot items. That can be fire, that can be somebody walking into an oven, this can be somebody walking over coals or fire, or otherwise touching fire, swallowing fire, anything. And we see that correlated in the history of magic. People doing this through deception, through trickery, and also just understanding of physics. You have fire walking, coal walking, which was believed to be some sort of a magical power, and then you see people doing it nowadays. A lot of motivational speakers have it as, that's the thing that they tie the end of their weekend with, where everybody comes together and, they teach them how to walk on the fire so that, they're not burned, but they're basically rolling their heels as they're walking, and they have to keep moving. And they're able to walk over burning coals and remain uninjured. Usually people don't get injured. Sometimes they do. But usually they do not get injured. And so there's all these different techniques, and then there's other stuff in here which there's a bunch of stuff in here which isn't tied to deception, at least not obviously, but we see reflections of it used today and a few decades ago, a few hundred years ago, and it's done with deception. You have you have instances in this book of phenomena such as psychic surgery. For those of you who aren't familiar with psychic surgery, this is thought to be a trick, and many times we see it is a trick. But you'll have somebody who has some sort of physical ailment, they're sick, and the shaman or the witch doctor will come and they'll do a psychic surgery where with just their hands they'll be able to apparently reach into the person's body and pull things out which have entered into them, which are causing them their illness. And you've seen guys on TV do it and expose how it's done. Penn and Teller famously have exposed it, and you've had a lot of other people who have exposed it because there are people who do it with trickery. This book, though, presents it as a real thing. Now, it's very hard when you're looking at old texts to determine whether this was done with deception, whether this was done for real. I think there's a prevalence for a lot of people to just approach it with just outright skepticism and say that it was totally fake back then because it's totally fake now. This is the attitude that people have and they bring into it. I don't approach it with this attitude. I just look at it as a historical thing, and I think that people document their experiences, they document their life, and the reason why they're documenting things is because it was happening, it was important. The people documenting it may not have understood exactly what they were seeing, but I don't think that we can just look at it from this advanced perspective and totally discredit all their experiences. So I will say that, and a lot of the stuff in this book does tie into magic, the different rituals that they do in order to create effects. When you look at the history of magic, before religion, this was people directly interacting with the environment to do something and cause an effect. For example, you see a sorry, my mind is going blank because there's so many examples. But for example, I'm just trying to give the most basic thing that without explaining it. But you'd have people who believed that their spirit was tied to an object or a place, and if that thing got damaged, if it got lost, somebody could steal. I don't know if you guys have watched Harry Potter or something like that, but Harry Potter has a similar idea, which is based on historical magic, the real magic, which is the idea that the villain in the movie Voldemort hides his soul or his his spirit amongst different physical objects. So Harry Potter and his friends have to go and find these different objects and try to I think they have to destroy them in order to destroy his spirit, so that he can't come back to life. I believe I'm not huge on Harry Potter, so don't give me a hard time. But I believe that's part of the story, and we had this throughout time where people thought that part of them was tied to something, and if it got destroyed or injured, that would correspond to their body, their physical health, or it would correspond to the health of the natural environment around them. So there's tons and tons of instances throughout history of this. We also see in this, they talk about the classic Indian rope trick. Now this is what we would call a myth, or part of the mythology from ancient India and other parts of the world near India, but there's similar stories in many places. But this idea of some sort of stairway going to heaven, the shamans or the people ascend spiritually and partly physically, partly spiritually, depending on the story. But they descend up this mystical ladder, and this could be a ladder of knives. It could be a rope. It could be made out of arrows. It usually the ladder is somewhat dangerous, which stops a regular person from going up it, and the person ascending and then them being destroyed in some way, and their body, from the classic rope in Indian rope trick, different body parts fall down, and then they are restored. So you have elements of this, and every single story is different, but it is interesting to see this and see it in the mythology, because we think, oh, Indian rope trick, this is something that Indian magicians were doing, and there's other people who have claimed to see it, different versions of it, different versions of the story of how the trick was done, and then you see it being presented as a thousands of years as a story that's thousands of years old. It gives you a totally different perspective on it. So you take a book like this, and it really goes all around the world, honestly, from Siberia, North and South America, Indonesia, Tibet, China, really everywhere, Japan, and you start to understand you start to understand what people believed and their experiences of the world and of magic. And to be honest, from a magical standpoint, is reading this book going to help you? Yes and no. Technically, I think you're better off reading a lot of just traditional books on the history of magic if you want it. But this is more of an advanced book, I would say. This is definitely not for everybody. But I believe, and there's other magicians who believe this, like Juan Tamariz, but there is something, and it could be genetic, it could be psychological, just is a deep unconscious thing, but a lot of the stories that we love to tell and that are almost tied to us in some weird way are based on these classic mythological stories that have happened throughout time, that repeat throughout time, and have been told throughout time. And you see these same stories appear all over the world in different ways, and it could be that this is a shared experience. It could be that it's something that's just tied in our subconscious for whatever reason of the programming of our neurons, but for whatever reason we do have this connection to these mythologies, these mythical stories and legends. And when you do look at the magic that was done, and I'm not talking about magic tricks, I'm talking about just that idea of magic, people having some sort of real power or interfacing with something that is giving them power or giving them access to power, divination, what have you. It just allows you to understand it and to see the deeper meaning of what they were doing, see the power of what they were doing, because you get the context of the world that they were living in, sort of the way that they lived, how the society was built, the importance of them, but then also you get to see maybe the possible methods. A book like this is studying it from a historical perspective, not from a magician standpoint. So there's no technique in this book, but you start to think, okay, this is weird. One of the initiations is this person, being cut with knives or whatever, and you're like, okay, this is weird. What does this mean? And you start to think, what does this mean for? What does this mean for people? Why are they doing this? And what impact does it have on their audience? Because at the end of the day, partly all this stuff is for themselves, and a big part of it is for the people around them. I personally believe that some of these people throughout time were tricksters. They were doing deception, and their mentors were teaching them secrets. I think other times they really believed that they did have power, I believe there was deception all throughout it, to be quite honest, on various levels. Because anytime you can give anybody some sort of sense of power, there's obviously going to be people using that, exploiting that, and keeping it a secret, not really revealing. But it is a fascinating book, and I would say for somebody who just performs magic in a show, you look at something as basic as the regular effects that we do in terms of, finding the four aces, or, the cut in the restored rope, or, really anything. And it all ties back to these mythologies, this, what's lost, what's found, the things that are out in the earth being separated, these elements, and mystically, magically bringing them back together, something being destroyed and being restored. And we, as magicians, we just see these things as effects. We look at the technique. Okay, I'm going to show people this is a rope. It's solid. Now we're going to cut it. Okay, it's cut. Now it's two pieces. Now we're going to put it back together by magic, and it's back. And it's like, okay, that's a magic effect. But what's behind that is so much more. And there's something there, and we don't need to tell that story overtly, with some sort of mythological story about, the restoration and the tribes and the shaman. We don't need to, if somebody wants to, they can. People can present things any way they want. But just having that knowledge, and you hear Juan Tamariz talk about it in his book, The Magic Rainbow, which I'm reading, and it's just, it just makes our inner world richer. The more that we know about magic, we know about the history of our art, what has been done, what it means, it just coalesces in some way, and it comes out in some other way in our art form. And we don't know how we're going to use it, but I mean, to explain how this works, you see it with filmmakers, you see it with authors, you see it with painters. People study their art form. They learn as much as they can. They absorb. They really just consume as much as their own art form that they can in the history of their art form, and they want to know about this person and that person. And then they just bring it into, I don't know how, but it melds in with their own character, their own personality, and they're able to bring it out into the world. And it could be anything. It doesn't need to be an art. It could be, in anything that you do. I was reading about Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson was a very famous boxer, and he had an amazing trainer, and he would just, every single night, he would watch videos of boxers and find out all these stories of all these guys and ask all these old boxers, about their lives, about their fights, and he just knew everything. And so when he would approach boxing, he could do it with so much knowledge that you don't necessarily see if you don't know what you're looking for. But this is a guy who knows all these techniques from, hundreds and hundreds of boxers from the past, and he knows all these stories, and it just goes into what he does. And I think that's what we have to do with magic in order to become better. The more that we know, we bring these magicians of the past, and also the magic of the past, the mythology, the stories, everything. We just bring it, and it somehow evolves, and it stays alive in us and what we do. And it may not be an overt thing, but it definitely does influence our work. And for me, I would say I personally have an interest in this type of magic, the history of the world, everything. Now, this, when you see me perform magic, you don't get a sense of that because my magic, or maybe you do get a sense of it. But it's not an overt thing. But I do want to present magic as a real thing. I want to present it as a real experience. I don't want to be somebody who's just doing tricks, doing techniques. I want people to believe in magic. So I often just look at, the history of real magic, because I want to know, what's the psychology of these people who are doing it for real, and how are they bringing that into their work, and whether everything in this book and everything in the history of this type of thing was totally fake, or whether it's real, kind of really doesn't matter to me, because I understand that it's impossible to know one way or another. But it's also very interesting, because I also read books on the history of magic, and I see what gets discounted and gets thrown away. And I was just reading a book, one of the Chinese classics. It's called The Romance of Three Kingdoms. Not a magic book. It's a novelization of wars in China, I believe in the 2nd century of China. And there's a general in the book, and the general does have some sort of magical powers. And he's doing some sort of mind reading, he's doing some sort of divination. And I'm reading this, I'm like, oh wow, this is magic. This is a real guy, a historical guy. This is a novelization of it. A historical novelization. It was written hundreds of years ago, but it's still fascinating to read, because you look at it and you're like, oh, why is this guy's name never mentioned in the history of magic? And then you look at other people throughout time who are not recorded in the history of magic either. So I believe the true history of magic really extends beyond what has just really been a very limited perspective given to us through the regular history books on magic. And that's not to knock on anybody who's writing books on the history of magic. I enjoy them all. It's just that there's so many more things going on in the world, there's so many more stories, and the parallels are irrefutable, and the connections are irrefutable. They're unquestionable. So I really think to understand magic, the idea of magic, we have to go beyond just the magic books that are sold by the magic dealers, and look at what was magic thousands of years ago, back before we had real magic books, back before we had things that were obviously magic techniques. What was happening? And this goes right back to the very beginning of time, beginning of humanity. So I'm not gonna lie, it's a deep book. It's not a book for everybody. I enjoyed it tremendously. I would recommend it, but again, it really depends on how you want to spend your time and what your interests are. For me, I'm fascinating this stuff. I'm writing a book. One of the chapters is on the history of magic. I wanted to have some notes on some things that I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to get it right. So I'm like, okay, let me let me get some notes down. But I also had a good time reading it. So definitely, I recommend it. I would recommend it, but definitely not for everybody. If you are just somebody who is learning about magic and you're new to magic, and you just want to learn about magic books, magic tricks, this is not the book for you. If you're just a performing magician and you don't really want to know about the history of real magic or anything like that, I would say stay away from it. Because it will not be of interest to you. But for the people who are interested in the history of magic, and maybe you've read a few books on history of magic and you have some sort of grasp and you want to go beyond that, then I would recommend this book for you.